In the winter of 1239, in a candle-lit bazaar on the edge of a Seljuk city, a celebrated jurist, Kamal of Rum, was surrounded by students hauling manuscripts. He had spent 30 years polishing answers. A stranger stepped from the crowd. Sunburned, barefoot, smelling of road dust and rose water. They called him Nur, the lantern, because he carried no book yet lit up every room. Nur bowed once and asked a riddle. Why does the perfected messenger whisper, "I did not know you as you deserve," while an intoxicated saint dares to cry, "Glory to me"? Kamal reached for doctrine. The words came, then failed. Something in him cracked, the way thin ice breaks over deep water. He collapsed. When he rose, he locked his library, dismissed his admirers, and for 40 nights sat alone, letting the world's noise die down until he could hear what had always been there. That moment is the first operation of inner alchemy, the blackening, Jung's nigredo. Before the soul speaks, the mind must learn silence. Silence, to most people, sounds like emptiness. But to the old masters it was a substance, a womb. In alchemical drawings, the first vessel is sealed and placed into darkness. Nothing happens on the surface, yet everything is happening underneath. The heat works invisibly. The lead sweats. The false form begins to rot. Kamal discovered the same law in his own chest. At first, the stillness was unbearable. Without lectures, without debate, without praise, his mind screamed like a spoiled child. Memories rose, old humiliations, hidden envy, grief he had never named. He understood why people fear quiet. The moment the world goes mute, the inner courtroom begins. Jung would later call this the encounter with the shadow, the parts of you exiled from the mask you wear in public. The Sufis had a harsher name. The commanding self, the appetite soul that demands distraction, certainty, and control. It hates silence because silence removes its stage. But silence is not repression. It is listening. It is the art of letting the deeper organ of knowing, what the Sufis call the heart, begin to speak in symbols, sensations, and sudden truth. Here is the secret the modern world forgets. Noise is not just sound. Noise is identity maintenance. Every scroll, every argument, every hot take is a small spell cast to keep the ego from dissolving. We don't fill our days because we busy. We fill them because we're terrified of what appears when we stop. The mystics of Persia understood this with brutal clarity. In their retreats, they practiced a discipline of inward watchfulness, sitting so still that even their opinions could be heard forming. They weren't hunting information. They were hunting the source of the self. Jung's reached the same threshold by another door. When he withdrew from public life, he began a descent into the psyche and discovered that the unconscious speaks like an ancient poet, not in arguments, but in images, faces, animals, temples, ruined cities, symbols rising uninvited. He didn't dismiss them. He treated them as emissaries. That is why silence is required. The soul does not communicate in the language of the daytime mind. It communicates the way dreams do, through metaphor, paradox, and living pictures. When you become quiet enough, the psyche stops sending you pain as a warning and starts sending you guidance as a map. A tale from Attar's tradition makes this precise. Not scholars, not saints, just a flock of birds, exhausted by their own squabbling, searching for a sovereign who could end their confusion. A hoopoe, sharp-eyed and merciless, becomes their guide. He tells them the king they want cannot be reached by cleverness, only by passage through 7 valleys. In the first valley, they abandon comfort. In the second, they burn with longing. But in the third, often called the Valley of Insight, most collapse, because here the birds learn a humiliating law. Every certainty they carried was a veil. Every opinion was a feather that made them feel important and kept them from flying higher. This is dissolution, the alchemical washing of fixed identity. In Jung's terms, it's when the persona, the social mask, starts to crack and the psyche demands a wider truth. People resist this stage by getting louder, by explaining more, by doubling down. But the Hupo insists. If you want the real, you must tolerate not knowing. The mind must be unseated. The inner king must die before a truer ruler can appear. Silence is the valley where that death becomes possible. Because silence removes the audience the ego performs for. This is why silence feels like a threat. The ego survives by narration. Here is who I am. Here is what I believe. Here is why I'm right. Remove the narration, and the ego loses its borders. It begins to leak. The Sufis describe the lower self as a commander barking orders: eat, chase, defend, compare. It speaks in urgency. It manufactures emergencies. It will offer you anything: music, gossip, outrage, even spiritual content, as long as you don't sit still long enough to meet what you've buried. Jung saw the same mechanism in modern patients. The psyche will create symptoms when the soul is ignored. Anxiety is often the alarm bell of unlived truth. Addiction is often the ritual of avoiding grief. Compulsion is often the substitute for meaning. So when Kamal sat alone, he didn't relax. He entered a furnace. Thoughts rose like black smoke. Old desires argued their case. Old wounds demanded a witness. This is the classic mortificatio, the inner death. The alchemist drew it as a king being cut down, not because life is cruel, but because transformation requires a sacrifice. The false ruler must be dethroned. And here is the paradox. The moment you stop fighting your own darkness, it stops feeling like an enemy. It becomes material, raw lead, something you can finally transmute. Rumi tells a variation of a door parable. But let's shift the scene. Imagine a traveler arriving at a lodge in the desert, knocking while wind drags sand across the threshold. A voice calls from within. Who knocks? The traveler says, "It is me." The door stays shut. The voice replies, "This house is too small for two." So the traveler leaves, angry, embarrassed, then wanders until the desert strips him bare. Days without applause, nights without distraction. Slowly, the me he defended begins to look like a costume. He returns a year later and knocks again. Who knocks? This time, he says, "It is you." The door opens as if it had always been open. This is the cute spiritual story. It's an operating manual. The door is the psyche's inner chamber, the heart, the self, the hidden center. As long as you approach it with a clenched identity, you remain outside, because the soul is not impressed by your biography. Jung's called this movement individuation, not becoming special, but becoming whole, integrating what you disowned, reconciling opposites, realizing the ego is a tool, not a throne. Silence is the desert that removes the costume. In that stripping, the real work begins. Now we enter the dark academia corridor. The old library at midnight, the lamp hissing, the margins crowded with symbols. Because the soul doesn't lecture, it writes in glyphs. In Jung's solitude, he began to record inner scenes the way a medieval scribe records visions. A red sun, a serpent, a wise old figure, a ruined cathedral, a child made of light. He treated these images as real psychic facts, messages from a deeper intelligence. That record became his private scripture, a map of the underworld and the treasures hidden there. This is where modern people make a fatal mistake. They demand the soul speak in pure sentences, like a self-help book. But the unconscious is older than language. It speaks in the grammar of myth. That's why Attar uses birds, why Rumi uses lovers in taverns, why Ibn Arabi speaks in paradox. Literal speech breaks under the weight of the real. Silence is the page on which symbols appear. When the chatter stops, you begin to notice dream patterns, repeating motifs, strange coincidences. The psyche's way of arranging the world into meaning. The alchemists called this correspondence. As within, so without. And once you see correspondence, your life stops being random. Your bad habits stop being moral failures. They become encrypted messages. Misplaced hunger, distorted longing, a wounded part asking for reunion. The alchemists insisted they weren't merely melting metals. They were revealing a law of the soul. Heat applied to matter mirrors attention applied to the psyche. The sealed flask is the mind in stillness. The hidden reaction is the transformation you cannot force. In Sufi language, this is unveiling, the slow removal of veils that distort perception. First, the veil of distraction, constant input. Then the veil of certainty, opinions that feel like identity. Then the veil of performance, living for an audience. And deeper still, the veil of separation itself. Jung's described the same descent as moving from ego to self. The ego wants control. The self wants wholeness. The ego wants comfort. The self wants truth. That is why silence feels unproductive, because it serves a different master. Here's the practical key. When you sit quietly, resist the urge to interpret too quickly. Let images, feelings, and impulses rise without immediately naming them. Naming is often a way to dominate. The soul doesn't open to domination. It opens to hospitality. Do this long enough, and a strange reversal happens. Your outer conflicts begin to look like mirrors. The argument with a friend echoes an inner split. The procrastination echoes a hidden fear. The compulsive habit echoes an unloved part demanding warmth. Silence doesn't just make you calm. It makes you accurate. It returns you to reality. There is a saying attributed to the prophet: contemplation outweighs years of mechanical devotion, not because rituals are useless, but because ritual without presence is only movement. Words without awareness are just noise wearing sacred clothing. This is where the wounded healer enters. Jung's observed that what we most avoid often becomes our medicine, if we dare to meet it consciously. The ache you numb with a habit is usually the exact doorway you need, but the doorway only appears when you stop running. Silence is how you stop running without becoming violent toward yourself. You sit. The discomfort rises. The craving rises. The grief rises. And you do not immediately obey. That is not suppression. It is sovereignty. The Sufis called this saber, not passive patience, but the strength to remain steady inside the fire. In that fire, you begin to see the true anatomy of your habits. The habit is rarely the problem. It is the strategy. A strategy to avoid loneliness, to avoid shame, to avoid the rawness of being alive. When you meet the rawness directly, without anesthetic, something shifts. The habit loses its mythic power. Alchemists called this stage whitening, clarity after the blackening. Not bliss yet, just clean perception. The mind becomes less sticky. You can witness urges like weather. And in that space, choice is reborn. So how does a modern person, surrounded by screens, alarms, obligations, practice this without fleeing to a cave? You do it the way alchemists worked, in small, controlled operations, repeated daily. Begin with 5 minutes of sealed vessel time. Same place, same hour if possible. No music, no podcast, no productive input. Just sit as if you were keeping vigil beside something sacred. You are not trying to erase thought. You are learning not to be possessed by it. Use a single anchor. The Sufis used remembrance, repeating a divine name until the syllables dissolved into presence. Jung's used active imagination, allowing an image to arise, then engaging it with respectful attention. Either way, the method is the same. Return, return, return. And here's the crucial detail. When the mind starts bargaining, check your phone. Do it later. This is pointless. Recognize the voice. That is the old ruler begging to keep the throne. Don't argue with it. Don't shame it. Just don't obey. Over weeks, you will notice something almost embarrassing. How repetitive your inner life is. The same fear in different costumes. The same resentment looping. The same fantasy trying to rescue you. This repetition is not failure. It's the psyche showing you its knots. Silence reveals the knot so you can untie it. As the practice deepens, silence stops being a time slot and becomes a faculty you carry. The noise outside may continue, but inside, you develop a small distance, a gap where the soul can breathe. This is the alchemical principle of the interval, space between stimulus and response. In that interval, you stop living as a reflex. You begin living as an observer. And observation is the first form of liberation. Jung's warned that the unconscious doesn't become harmless because you ignore it. It becomes fateful. What you refuse to face returns as destiny. Repeated relationships, repeated failures, repeated cravings. Silence interrupts the spell. It lets you see the pattern before it chooses for you. The Sufis describe this as moving from the commanding self to the reproaching self. The inner conscience that begins to notice, I am being dragged. Not with guilt, but with clarity. And then deeper to the tranquil self, where the heart is no longer at war with itself. You will start to recognize your triggers in real time. The moment you reach for distraction, the moment you reach for sugar, the moment you reach for another person's attention. Instead of acting, you can ask, what am I actually hungry for? That question is pure gold, because it converts compulsion into meaning. It turns habit into message, and messages can be answered. Compulsions only repeat. At this stage, symbols begin to organize your life like constellations. A recurring dream, a phrase that follows you, a random book that keeps appearing, a coincidence too precise to dismiss. Jung's called this synchronicity, not superstition, but the psyche and the world briefly speaking the same sentence. In Ibn Arabi's language, reality is a mirror polished by perception. When the mirror is clouded by noise, you see only fragments. When it clears, existence becomes legible. Not because you control the world, but because you finally notice the patterns you were too distracted to read. The alchemists named this imaginatio, the subtle organ that perceives correspondences. Modern people confuse imagination with making things up. The ancients meant something sharper, the ability to receive images that carry truth without requiring proof. This is why the mystics taught with parables. A parable bypasses the ego's defenses. It slips beneath the argumentative mind and lands directly in the heart. The Masnavi is full of these coded transmissions, stories that seem simple until they start changing you from the inside. And once symbols start speaking, you realize the soul was never silent. You were. You were deafened by commentary. Silence restores hearing. It makes your inner life precise. And precision is what breaks paradigms. Because you can escape a truth, you finally see clearly. Now we approach the final operations. Not just insight, but transmutation. The old habits don't die because you try harder. They die because a deeper hunger is finally fed. Alchemists called the last phase the reddening, the return of life to the purified substance. Not the anxious life of craving, but the steady life of meaning. Jung would say, the libido stops leaking into compulsions and returns to the work of becoming whole. This is where silence becomes dangerous in the best way. Because it reveals what you actually want beneath what you think you want. Many people say they want comfort, but they were starving for intimacy with existence. They say they want pleasure, but they were starving for awe. They say they want control, but they were starving for trust. In the Sufi path, this is the pivot from fana to baqa, from the dissolving of the false self to the abiding of the true self. You don't become a blank void. You become more real. Less reactive, less performative, less fragmented. Your relationships shift because you stop demanding others fix what silence taught you to hold. Your work shifts because you stop chasing validation and start chasing integrity. Even your addictions shift because the spell breaks. You can see the mechanism while it's happening. This is the philosopher's stone in daily life. Not mystical fireworks, but a new center of gravity. Return to the birds. After famine, storms, and inner collapse, only a remnant survives. Not the loudest, not the smartest, the ones who could endure stripping. They arrive at the mountain of the king and demand an audience. They were led into a hall that feels like a dream. Still air, polished surfaces, a silence so dense it becomes a presence. And then the final teaching. There is no throne, no separate monarch waiting to crown them, only mirrors. They see themselves, again and again, until the meaning strikes like lightning. The sovereign they sought was never outside. Their longing was a compass, not a lack. Their journey was a refinement of perception. The king was the self revealed when all veils burned away. This is the ultimate cruelty of distraction. It convinces you the answer is elsewhere. A new philosophy, a new lover, a new purchase, a new identity. But Attar's Hall of Mirrors says, the treasure is here, but you cannot see it while you are noisy. Jung's entire project points to the same conclusion. Wholeness is not built by adding more. It is uncovered by integrating what was split off. The shadow brought home. The wounded part embraced. The opposites reconciled. Silence is the mirror polish. It doesn't give you a new self. It shows you what has been there, waiting, under the dust of constant motion. So here is the closing question. Not for comments, not for debate, but for the private chamber of your day. If you remove the noise for 1 week, no compulsive scrolling, no background audio, no reflex stimulation, what would rise first? Craving? Grief? Rage? Loneliness? Good. That is the lead. That is the prima materia. That is what can be turned. The alchemists never despised the dark substance. They honored it. Because without it, there is no gold. The soul does not need more of your words. It needs your presence, your willingness to sit at the edge of discomfort without fleeing, to let the commanding self exhaust its tantrum, to let the heart speak in its own language. Symbol, intuition, quiet knowing. Make one small vow. 5 minutes tomorrow. Seal the vessel. Light no screams. No explanations. Just listen. When the mind panics, smile gently, as if you were watching a child protest bedtime, and return to stillness. In time, the silence becomes inhabited. Not empty, inhabited, and you begin to recognize what the mystics meant. The real has been speaking the entire time. The tragedy was never divine absence. The tragedy was your constant translation into noise. So, when you finally stop, what will you hear?